Welcome. I'd like to welcome all of you to today's post-election lunch and learn. My name is Sarah Zenaida Gould, and I am Interim Executive Director of the Mexican American Civil Rights Institute. Today is our last virtual charla of the year. Today, we'll talk about Mexican American perspectives on voting, the 2020 election, and key issues to follow during the new administration. Before I introduce the panelists, I'd like to thank our funders, especially the City of San Antonio and all of our individual donors. If you'd like to learn more about supporting MACRI, I invite you to visit somosmacri.org/donate, and there's information there about how you can make a donation. Thank you. And now I would like to introduce our guests. Today we are joined by 3 Stanford alums. First up, we have Dr. Cecilia Ballí, founder and principal of Culture Concepts, a strategic and creative consultancy that provides ethnographic research, cultural analysis, storytelling, and strategic messaging. Dr. Ballí is a cultural anthropologist with special expertise in US-Mexico border and Latino issues. She's a writer at large for Texas Monthly and has been published in Harper's Magazine and the New York Times Magazine as an independent journalist. She was also previously an assistant professor at the University of Texas at Austin. Next up, we have Michelle Tramiel, Executive Director of the Texas Organizing Project. Founded in 2009, TOP is the largest Black and Latino grassroots progressive organization in Texas with capacity to engage in year-round community organizing and significantly grow the electorate. Their work is concentrated in the largest and fastest growing counties of Harris, Fort Bend, Dallas, and Bexar, with the goal of transforming Texas into a state where working people of color have the power and representation they deserve. And Dr. Stephen Pitti, Professor of History and American Studies and Director of the Center for the Study of Race, Indigeneity, and Transnational Migration at Yale University. He is the author of The Devil in Silicon Valley, Northern California, Race and Mexican Americans, and has a forthcoming book titled The World of Cesar Chavez. Dr. Pitti is a former member of the National Park Service Advisory Board, for which he chaired the National Historic Landmarks Committee, and he also served on the National Park Service's American Latino Scholars Expert Panel, for which he authored the core essay for the National Park Service's American Latinos and the Making of the United States theme study. So now I would like to turn it over to Cecilia and ask her to tell us about a recent study she completed on Texas Latinos and perspectives on voting.
Great. Thank you for having me, Sarah. And I am here to present the work that I did with a team, another anthropologist and sociologist, Monica Lugo and Michael Powell were my teammates on this. It's a project we did for Texas Organizing Project. So that's why I'm here in Michelle's company. Really enjoyed doing this unique study on Latino voters. And our interest was to try to better understand and explain voter participation and civic engagement among Latinos, and how to come up with better language and narratives about how Latinos relate to the political system and why ultimately they do or don't cast a vote, and what their political values are, or their political lives, as we like to say. So today I'm gonna take you through some of our key findings of that study. And for that, I'm gonna share my screen, hopefully successfully. Okay, are you seeing it or not? No.
Not yet.
Okay, sorry, this was working for us earlier. You're not seeing it?
Not yet, no. If you, let's see. So I actually have a copy of it if you'd like me to try, but okay.
I'm pressing, apologies for that.
Okay. Here we go.
Okay, I think I've got it, apologies.
There it is, I see it.
So sorry, guys. I've done so many of these, and still I get stumped every single time I have to start a slideshow. So let's get moving through this. We spoke with 100 voters throughout the state of Texas in Dallas, Houston, San Antonio, El Paso, and the Rio Grande Valley. And we were doing one-on-one interviews because we felt that this is where the polls fail to give us more information as to how people think. And so we call our method authentic listening, as we were trying not to impose any of our own frameworks and instead just understand views through people's own eyes and how they make sense of politics. And so, one of the big takeaways for us is that we compared how voters and non-voters speak, and we realized that empowerment and belonging were two big themes. And basically, voters speak with a stronger sense of empowerment and belonging, and they have that experience in their lives even beyond voting. And non-voters tend to speak differently. But voters can articulate also how government affects their life, and they're often in conversation with other people who vote. They're able to discuss politics with other people, and they have a firm sense, that they have a right to be heard, whether or not the outcome of the election is in their favor, that their vote matters. By contrast, non-voters, one of the big myths that I wanted to help dispel was this idea that Latinos are simply apathetic, and that's why our voter turnout rates are lower than we'd like. Interestingly, none of the non-voters that we spoke with were apathetic in the sense that they were following politics. They knew their vote mattered. They knew exactly how government affects their lives, and they were simply choosing not to participate. We didn't find that. Instead, that's where you really have to do one-on-one interviews and get to the deeper reasons why people have suspicious views of voting or are not compelled to do it. And non-voters, by and large, felt that their vote didn't matter. And it was couched in a bigger conversation about how power resided in other places. They didn't articulate it that way, but a feeling that other people are the ones that ultimately make these decisions. So even if you vote, you're not going to make a difference. They often don't, or typically don't, come from voting backgrounds. We didn't speak to a single non-voter who had grown up watching their parents vote. And they have a harder time articulating how government affects their lives. So that's, I think, one area when we talk about organizing and activating voters is helping them to get a better sense of the very direct ways in which government is impacting their life on a day-to-day basis. But a lot of them were following political news, not all of them, but many of them that could speak to the dramas playing out in Washington. One of them was watching the impeachment proceedings. So I think that also busted this myth that we're uninformed. This study really reminded us that we need to think about voting as a social behavior. And I think that's what we brought in as social scientists, as anthropologists, and sociologists, is I think that voting mostly gets talked about as a rational decision that people make sitting down and deciding what's best for them. There are some studies that show that, the more you have seen people vote and the more you're around people who vote, the more likely you are to vote. And so this is a really key point for us that we need to communicate and that we feel also needs to be considered in organizing and activating people to vote, is that it's a habit that you build over time. And that's, eventually, if you do it regularly enough, it's election day and you feel guilty because you haven't gone out to vote. That's the place where we need to get people, and I think many of you can relate. I will confess I'm a highly educated person who knows that her vote matters. And in the past, there have been elections when I didn't feel compelled to walk out the door. And now I do, after working on the study and after, sort of realizing that it's something that the more you do, the more natural it feels. And, among Latinos, a lot of us come from families that haven't voted in the past, whether they're immigrant parents or they're second, third generation Latinos that haven't been voting. So we haven't watched that behavior. It hasn't been emulated. And like I said, also talking to other people about voting can help to spread that social habit, that practice. And so we talked in this study about the importance of developing voting communities. We're not calling it culture of voting because people tend to assign blame to Latino culture for many things. And we don't want the media to start saying that Latinos don't have a culture of voting. but rather it's a practice and habit that we're in the process of developing progressively across generations and over time. Around the question of partisanship, these are highly polarized times in this country. There's a lot of talk in the media about partisanship. The major media narrative is that this is a very partisan time in this country. We expected to see that with our interviewees, and we didn't. We saw the opposite. And what do we mean by that? Like, we're not saying that people don't vote consistently for one party or another, but even when they did, even for instance, some people who had always voted Democrat, when we asked them to fill on a form what party they belonged to, they would mark no affiliation. They just don't have a very strong sense of a relationship, of a commitment to a specific party. They don't articulate the platforms of those parties. We saw that a little more on the right is when people are articulating a specific ideology of the party. On the left, we didn't see it as much. And so instead, we saw people who were making sense of politics on their own, independently. And a lot of them have a range of views. Someone can have a view that's very progressive on one issue and conservative on another. And they also don't identify strongly with the labels of progressive or conservative. That's not the language they're using to make sense of their own values. Some of the reasons for this low partisanship, as we understand it, is one, neither party has historically developed a strong relationship or dialogue with the Latino community. We don't have a lot of families that have been voting across generations, and so you vote Democrat because your parents did. You do see that in the Rio Grande Valley, for instance, where people do have that tradition. But also, like I said, people's views are complex. And then we have a small group of emerging, young, typically college-educated Latinos. Some of them are choosing to define themselves as independent, specifically to reject a two-party system that they feel is not representing everybody. Around the question of race and ethnicity and identity, if we're trying to understand whether Latinos have a shared ethnic politics, a collective ethnic politics, we needed to understand if we have a collective ethnic identity, right? And so we explored this topic through various questions, but one of the key takeaways, we're not the first ones to say this, and I think you won't be surprised, is people actually don't relate very strongly to the term Latino, and even less Latinx or Latinx. And that's why we're not using that term in this study, is that that's a strategic term, an umbrella term that was created for organizing and political purposes. It's not a term that people are very familiar with on the ground yet. They're not sure what it means. It doesn't resonate. And Latino, some people, it was interesting how people define Latino in such different ways. Some folks will say, well, that's only people from Latin America, but not from the US. Others will say, well, that's Latin America, but not Mexico. Mexicans are Mexicans, And so we found that people relate strongly to their own nationality or ethnic identity. And in terms of umbrella terms, they're still using Hispanic a bit more than Latino. And a Latino decisions poll in California found the same thing, that even in California, Hispanic is still a little more widely used, not a little more, a lot more widely used than Latino. And I just say this because, it doesn't mean we have to change our terminology, but we wanted to raise awareness about the language that we use and whether that language is the language that people use themselves and can relate to. So for instance, the term person of color, we found that people on the ground here have different ideas of what it means, and they're not sure that it's referring to them, but it's not because they're trying to adopt a white identity or they think they're racially white, but rather we've sort of heard it, some more than others. Some felt that it's only being used to refer to African Americans, even though they themselves are non-white, Latinos are non-white. So, there was also a gap there. More than half of the people we spoke with didn't feel that there's a singular Latino vote. They feel the views are very diverse and wide-ranging, but they could see its potential as far as numbers, having a lot of people specifically on the left galvanize and vote for one party. The last point, I want to be careful in how I explain it. We didn't find that people were making references to a history of a shared history of fighting for voting rights or civil rights more broadly. And that's a history that exists in Texas and it exists nationally. And that's what MACRI is all about, which is why I'm so excited to be sharing these results here today. In Texas, we haven't told the story of Latinos being racialized, of Mexican Americans being racialized, and then of fighting for rights. And I think that having that sense of shared history would give people a sense that they're fighting for something common politically. And so I feel that that's where we need to do a lot of work in raising public awareness of that history of racism and of activism. A big takeaway for us is that overall, both Latinos who vote and who don't vote feel that the system doesn't reflect them, doesn't speak to them, doesn't incorporate them. You know, and at one level, they're aware that they're not proportionately represented. But even beyond that, you know, folks were talking about wanting candidates who really understand their daily realities. Even some voters we spoke with who have Latino representatives in their congressional district, for instance. But it's more of a sense that the people running for office do not know what it is to have a daily struggle as a Latino person. This came a lot more from working class people and for people living in poverty. And so they don't just want more Latinos in office, but they want candidates who can understand and validate their life experiences. And they want to feel heard and to feel seen. We had a couple of interesting themes that stood out in San Antonio and the Rio Grande Valley that were different from other regions. So that they were very specific to that region. And we think that they relate to political participation more broadly. And so we wanted to highlight some of those. A number of you may be joining us from San Antonio. In San Antonio, the themes were less directly about voting, but there was a lot of storytelling around, you know, generations of their parents and grandparents not getting to speak Spanish at school, being forced to change their names to English names, a lot of racial strife in the schools, a lot of tension between whites and blacks and Mexican Americans. And San Antonio has a strong legacy of racial segregation and educational and economic segregation. And, you know, relatively lower rates of economic mobility for a major urban region. And so we feel that this has created a sense of intergenerational disempowerment and a sense that things aren't changing or they don't change enough, and that if you vote, it's not necessarily going to change things. And this is particularly true of people living, you know, we spoke to a lot of Mexican Americans living in the West and South sides, and they have a very strong, empowering sense of identity based on that neighborhood, but they also have an awareness that those neighborhoods are typically not empowered and not by the government itself. In the Rio Grande Valley, there was a lot of conversation of local political culture that is very exclusive of people, that it's controlled by a few people that always run for office, the same last names, the same families. You know, voters told us that because there isn't any competition between the Democratic and Republican parties down there. Then we saw this election raises stakes around that. But in previous elections, it's been so controlled by Democrats that candidates are not running on issues or platforms. They're just running on their name or their photo, is what people would tell us. In Brownsville, 7 of my 10 interviewees mentioned, you know, these are they feel like high school student council or homecoming queen elections. And all of that combined with extreme levels of poverty in both the Valley and El Paso, you could feel the poverty a lot more. People are living more on the edge. And so it leads some people to feel that voting is not how they're going to make a difference. So in closing, you know, I can talk to some of the Valley outcomes. I know there's been a lot of interest in why there was such a big support for Trump this election. I can address that in the Q&A because I went down there not through this work, but independently as a journalist. I went back down after the election. But what I want to leave you with in terms of civic engagement on our project with Texas Organizing Project is that we identified as a team sort of these 3 pillars that we really have to work on and build on simultaneously in order to improve you know, the participation and the empowerment of Latinos. And one is this broader sense of empowerment and belonging civically, but it also relates to empowerment and belonging in other ways. You know, my sister runs the Guadalupe Cultural Arts Center in San Antonio, and I've been talking to her about how important that space is to help people feel more empowered and like they belong, and that translates into a voice that they want to turn into a political voice. And so developing this idea that you have a right to make claims from your government, that the government works for you, not the other way around, right? And a better understanding of how policies impact your life. Second is this point I talked about, developing voting communities and being immersed and surrounded by people who vote. And so how can we develop habits and practices where people take their kids to the polls, for instance, when they go vote, where folks activate their own family members? Now, that's a space where there's a lot of work that a lot of institutions, including MACRI, can get involved in. And then the third is really trying to build a government. That's what TOP is very invested in, a government that responds to the people that it serves and that it engages them throughout the year. And it actually advocates for policies that are going to produce change in people's lives. So in conclusion, we're trying to push back against this myth and narrative of the sleeping giant. Latinos are not asleep. They're following politics. And they're not going to magically all turn out in one election when we finally have the right candidate or the right issue. I think, we're in the process of developing voting habits and empowerment, and that's going to happen more and more as the political system properly responds to us and sees us. So we want to just continue to prioritize really listening to Latinos and having the voters define, what the platform should be instead of the other way around. So I'll end there, and that's my 15 minutes, but I'll be engaged in Q&A and dialogue after my colleagues do their own presentation.
Thank you, Cecilia. That was fascinating. So I want to turn it over to Michelle because it was TOP that commissioned this study. But of course, TOP is a multi-issue organization. And so in addition to trying to understand the voting patterns of Latinos in Texas, I'm just wondering about what you would like to see as maybe some priorities for a civil rights agenda over the next few years with this new administration. And maybe just tell us a little bit about some of those priorities that you have at the state and local level.
Sure. Hi, good morning, or good afternoon, everyone. So at TOP, we commissioned this study. Cecilia and I ran into each other actually at a Mexican-American civil rights celebration 2 years ago. And I was fresh off of the 2018 election cycle and feeling pretty frustrated that it seemed to me like in my hometown, San Antonio, that our work felt harder. Our work to engage people year round and also work to grow the electorate just felt harder. All of it felt harder in San Antonio. And, as an organizer, I understood this at in an instinctual level, and that, we really needed to dig a little bit deeper and understand how we need to do our work in a way that's going to grow participation. So was fortunate to run into Cecilia, and then we quickly put a plan in place to create this study. And, I do just kind of want to say, like, okay, so we have this like wonderful body of work, and like, now what do we do with it, right? And I think one of the key findings that is important to us in terms of, how we frame Latino participation and what it will take for us to show up and reflect, like be reflected in our state, right? Like, I think we just had what most people say was the biggest election of our lifetimes. We saw record turnout in Texas. And at the end of early vote, 55% of registered Latinos still had not cast a ballot. And that's almost 2 million Latinos who had not voted at the end of early vote. And we won't know all of the election day results for a little bit longer, but we can imagine, based on how it went on election day, it didn't get much higher than 45% participation. There are also close to another 2 million eligible but unregistered Latinos in our state. So when we talk about Latino representation, we don't have it yet. Even if we can see it in elected officials, that growing sort of diversity in our elected representation. When we think about our values and our policy priorities, we're still a very long way away from having that kind of representation and what we call at TOP a reflective democracy. So, that is where our work is. And, as Dr. Ballí's research shows, it's not just about election day, right? It isn't like, this is not like, what's the best messaging campaign we can come up with that's going to speak to Latinos, that's going to get them to come to the polls today, right? It's a reciprocal relationship between the voter and their government, the voter and the elected official and the candidate. And quite frankly, we're not doing enough to earn the vote of Latinos in this state. And so how do we change that relationship? How do we get, somebody asked a question about in the Valley, right, in RGV. If you think about your local state house candidate, and I don't mean to pick on anyone in particular, right? But their job is to get 50% plus one of the vote. That's what it means for them to win. And so think about the work that they do to win versus the work that we need to do to grow participation, right? The overwhelming majority of Latinos live in a safe Democratic or a safe Republican seat. And so who's talking to them, right? And are we doing the kind of reciprocal engagement that needs to happen? Are we in fact delivering change through policies that have an impact in our daily lives, right? When Latinos say they don't think that their vote matters, it is partially like my voice. It is partially things do not change after I have voted, right? And so, in terms of, what can a Biden administration do that's going to help us here in Texas grow our Latino participation, is pass policies that are going to have a real impact in people's lives. And, we saw in this last election cycle, COVID is at the top of people's minds. Obviously, in this election, it was what people were thinking about when they went to the ballot box. Healthcare remains a top priority for families and Latinos, right? So the economy, healthcare, many of us, are multi-generational families. So, immigration may or may not be at the top of list of priorities for us. But certainly, and in the research, immigration came up quite a bit. Latinos do believe that we should not be doing what we're doing right now. So, when we think about what can the Biden administration do immediately, we do need universal health care. Whether or not our organization believes in Medicare for all, I know that's not popular with everyone, but I do think, most Latinos believe that we should all have access to health care and what that looks like. And there's a role for the federal government to play. While we don't have universal health care, here in the state of Texas, we're about to have a legislative session, and Governor Abbott could any day of the week right now, any day of the week, he could by executive order expand Medicaid. And he's not doing it, right? And I know I'm sort of playing to the San Antonio crowd. In San Antonio, State Rep Diego Bernal has filed no less than four bills, all which would expand Medicaid in Texas. So there's a lot of work to be done there. If we can be successful in expanding Medicaid, that's going to have a big impact on people's lives. There are things that we can do at the local level to expand access to health care, although not as much, right? And so I think that it is very important that we're looking at every level of government, when it comes to housing, right? Like we have a moratorium on evictions right now scheduled to expire December 31st. It was an imperfect moratorium to begin with, like many loopholes. And unfortunately, people have still been getting evicted during this time. But, what's going to happen January 1st for so many families, not just in Texas, but across this country. And so, there's a real opportunity for the Biden administration to show leadership. There are big efforts to hashtag cancel the rent. There's a bill by Rep. Omar Ilhan that would, basically, cancel rent and mortgages. There's a fund created for landlords to apply for relief, right? So that they are still made whole, but that nobody is evicted. I think there's even an option to create a fund for lenders so that they can be made whole. There's so many things that can be done. That being said, there are also many options at the state level to ensure that nobody gets evicted and that, we're all able to stay safe in our homes at a time when we're being asked to not leave our homes unless we absolutely have to. Obviously, there's a lot of talk about a stimulus package between now and the end of the year that is just supposed to be a Band-Aid until we have a President Biden who can then do a more robust stimulus package. When we think about immigration, President-elect Biden has agreed to stop deportations. That seems like a bare minimum. Our organization also does a lot of work around reforming the criminal legal system. And so, right in Congress right now, there's what we call the Breathe Act. There's a lot of work, both the federal, state, and the local level that we can do to stop overly investing in the over-incarceration of our communities and start investing in creating healthy, sustainable, and equitable communities. And I think, we need to be looking at all levels of government. We need to be engaging Latinos in these conversations. And, less about messaging and more about delivering meaningful change and developing that reciprocal relationship. When TOP knocks on a door, the first thing that we ask is, what's going on in your life? What's important to you? How's it going? Right? And then when we have an understanding of what is happening in that person's lives, and let's remember, people live multi-issue lives, right? That's why we're a multi-issue organization. And so, somewhere on the ballot, somebody is making decisions that are responsible for the situation that we're in right now. And so so it's a relationship that we need to build. And people in government, elected officials, politicians, and quite frankly, even organizations like ours who act as a bridge, right? We're an intervention. We create this community of voting that you can belong to. We have to demonstrate that when you participate in your government, your life changes for the better. And that's the work ahead of us in 2021 and beyond.
Thank you so much, Michelle. That was a great overview of everything that is happening that I think a lot of our viewers are probably interested in keeping on top of. Particularly, I know, the evictions. Yeah, the eviction situation and the way that is exacerbating.
Did we lose her?
I'm sorry?
Stephen, do you maybe want to go? I think we lost.
Are we all good? Okay. Let me turn it over to Dr. Pitti. Steve, you've long been a champion of Mexican American history and the public humanities. Oops. I think we just lost Cecilia and Michelle. Well, we lost Michelle. Okay, I apologize for the technical difficulties. I think we're all okay now, right? Okay, I'm sorry. Let me go back. Dr. Pitti, I wanted to ask you, as a champion of the public humanities, what does this election have you thinking about in terms of now maybe a vision for the public humanities in the new administration?
Well, thank you, Sarah. I have to say I've learned so much just listening to Cecilia and Michelle. So in some ways, I feel like I want to leave questions about the elections to them. I certainly have lots of thoughts, but I want to defer mostly to the co-panelists who are really true experts on this. So, I do want to offer some thoughts and comments about the public humanities. And my comments really are not today going to be Texas specific per se, but I hope folks listening will see them as useful for thinking about Texas in the years to come. I think I will say this, that the November elections and the coverage of the elections underscore, in my mind, that we, in some ways, really don't know one another as well as we should, and that we need, I think, to improve our hubs and our forms of communication. And we need to improve the cultural work that we do together as neighbors, as fellow residents of cities, as fellow residents of regions like Texas. I'm reminded too of Cecilia's comment of the importance of giving Mexican Americans and other Latinos in particular, a sense of shared history and how important that cultural work will be in the years to come. I think that cultural work, public humanities, public history, should be very much part of our civil rights agenda during the Biden administration and well beyond the Biden administration. And some of the best traditions of Mexican American civil rights, of Latino civil rights, really has put cultural work, up there, if not front and center, somewhere high on the agenda of organizational efforts, individual efforts over time. We have wildly different narratives about the United States, and we know that from the November elections. Our histories, our forms of cultural expression, and even what's happening day to day in the world we're living in. As a historian, I'm partly inclined to say that this kind of thing has been true for a long time in the United States, but I do think there's reason to believe that matters of this sort have gotten worse in recent years. So why is that? I mean, for one thing, I think it's because the last 40 years in the US has witnessed accelerating economic inequality throughout our country, contributing to lots of understandable and righteous anger and desperation. It's also true, I think, that the last 40 years has seen massive international and domestic migrations that have changed the demography not only of Texas, but of places like Alaska and Mississippi and Maine and you name it. And it's, of course, because political candidates have used sharp political rhetoric to their own advantage to demonize Latinos, to demonize Muslim Americans, African Americans, and many others. In my mind, in this context, cities and towns and states that do not have longstanding and powerful cultural institutions that represent Latino perspectives, and that don't have Latino financial and political power behind those institutions that really support those perspectives, have really suffered a lot in recent years. In my mind, as a society, we have failed to invest enough in our public culture generally, and we've disinvested too much in public libraries and public museums and public parks, public schools, and so forth. We failed above all, I think, to invest in the humanities, the arts of free people, the commitment that we should have to deep understanding, to battling misinformation, the skills that we need to bring our different worlds together, to express ourselves well, the skills that help us distinguish between rhetoric and reality. These are all, important things that we can learn from the humanities. And these failures have hurt our communities, and they've hurt all communities. We're a long way from having, in cultural terms, what Michelle called a reflective democracy. And that's in part, I think, to our cultural failures in recent years. As Cecilia noted, Latinos do want to be seen in the public sphere, and they want to be recognized, I think, by cultural institutions and also by political leaders. Those institutions and those leaders need to be listening carefully in the years to come to Mexican American communities and other Latino communities. So as we proceed further into the 2020s, I would argue that we need a broad public commitment, an energetic commitment to reanimating the public humanities over the next decade. This is not going to be the work of just one presidential administration or one state governor or the mayor of San Antonio. it's going to require all of us to make a much longer and much deeper commitment. And so I wanted to today suggest that we might call this commitment something like our 2026 project. And I say that in part to extend beyond at least the first term of the Biden administration. In 2026, the US will mark the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence in 1776. And we can therefore anticipate in 2026 a lot of public retrospection and a lot of anticipation around that important year, that important milestone. There are going to be many discussions of history and of culture at national and local levels in 2026 that reference 1776. Politicians will predictably speak about societal values and about philosophical principles and the like. The National Endowment for the Humanities has already announced a project entitled A More Perfect Union with 2026 in mind. But as far as I can tell, there have been relatively few public discussions in Texas or elsewhere of the semi-sesquicentennial, that 250th anniversary. And I just wonder, those of you who are watching today, how many of you have thought much about 2026, about what's coming in 2026 and the kinds of discussions we're going to have then. So I want to challenge us here today to think about, maybe three things. First, how can we use that moment of 2026 for our own advantages? Second, how can we assure that 2026 advances our common commitment to Latino communities, to their well-being and to their representation in many settings? And third, how can we assure that the right people and the right organizations will lead the work around 2026 and that we can all do this work together? I think we should see this coming anniversary as an opportunity that should not be missed, but I think we have to plan now. Now, I don't have a fully fleshed out 2026 project with a lot of details to propose, but I will offer 5 initial thoughts about the Latino public humanities that are kind of organized around this idea of 2026 for consideration. First, I'd say, let's keep in mind that there are many dangers lurking in these moments of national commemoration. We should be concerned in advance that 2026 could contribute to many types of political backlash, for example, against immigrants or against Latinos or against others that seem threatening. In some ways, anniversaries like this one have been opportunities for backlash in the past. This kind of thing happened in the centennial in 1876 and the bicentennial in 1976 in some ways. And in the 2020s, some stories about historical reenactments of 1776 are almost certainly going to be quite exclusive and quite reactionary in their tone. So we should be preparing ourselves for these, as the year approaches, anticipating how we might manage narratives that position Latinos as a threat to the United States, while allowing ourselves ways to expand narratives about the country and challenge Anglophone, East Coast, Founders Day kind of histories that might provide us very little space as Latinos or the wrong space as Latinos, or even deny us a presence in the United States. So we need to be careful, I think. Second, as we approach the 2026 project, I would urge us to proceed in multilingual ways, thinking and programming not just in English, but in many languages to engage with both the past and the present. For Latino communities, I think that, of course, primarily means not only English, but Spanish, though we should acknowledge many forms of Spanish in the contemporary United States, the ongoing importance of indigenous languages in our communities, and obviously the Spanglish that represents our changing cultural dynamics in the 21st century. It's obvious there's some practical applications of this. It's obvious that we will want museum exhibits in 2026 to include Spanish translations for visitors who don't speak or read in English comfortably. But I think it's just important for us to think about how language has worked in the past and the present and what it can do for us in the future. Spanish, as historian Rosina Lozano has argued, is a colonial language. It's also an immigrant language, and it's a language of politics. So we should, I think, as 2026 approaches, be thinking about how we can use language to ask hard questions about colonialism, to have better conversations led by immigrants, and to unsettle the ways in which politicians have used Spanish and English in different types of ways. Third point, I would suggest that a 2026 project should dedicate itself to saving our complex past as Mexican Americans and other Latinos. This is emergency work in my mind. You know, we need in the 2020s to save our histories. We need to save them from bulldozers that are eliminating our neighborhoods and our historic sites. We need to save them from the internet that fails to permanently archive our correspondence with one another and eliminates web pages of organizations from consideration by people in the future. We need to save our histories from the passing of generations of people in our communities who were born in the 1940s or 1950s or 1960s, people who hold keys to understanding the 20th century, but who will pass in the years to come. We have to invest in the 2020s in this work of saving our histories. Fourth point out of 5, we should invest in a 2026 project in the museums and the cultural institutions that can archive and interpret our communities while hosting Latino-led conversations. Those 3 words that I just mentioned are important. They need to archive, they need to interpret, and they need to host. So as we move towards and beyond the year 2026, I'd argue that we need smart, curated discussions and carefully assembled resources for the public that are based in the humanities. And we need to support the organizations that foreground dialogues involving broad ranges of people and leaders of institutions who are positioned to guide our understandings of the past and the present through humanities conversations. And now, 5th and finally, I would urge us as we approach 2026 to commit to institutionalizing the public representation of Latinos in the past and Latinos in the present. You know, we should be celebrating and doubling down on the good work that already does this kind of thing, such as, you know, I think, for example, the Refusing to Forget project in Texas that I'm sure many people already know. But we should also be pressing leaders of our local and our national governments to represent and preserve our histories and to support our artists more energetically. We should take a close look at institutional obstacles that are blocking efforts at preservation and at creativity, from the kind of mentoring programs that exist and may not be doing their work to the best of their abilities, to linguistic barriers, to discriminatory government regulations that make preservation hard. One example close to my heart is the importance of expanding federal protection of critical Latino historical sites in the coming years. Earlier this week, Professor Sarah Bronin of the University of Connecticut wrote a great analysis of this problem in the Los Angeles Times about how the National Park Service really needs to reconsider some of its guidelines in order to allow us to actually place historical sites of importance on the National Registry or to make them National Historic Landmarks. But institutionalizing public representations of Latinos grounded in the humanities also will require that we commit to restoring and improving history and literature curricula in our public schools that include Latinos. All of you know that these types of things are very much being debated in Texas and elsewhere. And institutionalizing public representations also will require that we advocate for public and private funding to programs and institutions at all levels that can represent Latino stories. This means everything from the NEH and NEA to community college efforts to local public libraries and publicly funded museums. And it reminds me anyway, of the potential leadership that a new Smithsonian Museum of the American Latino devoted to this kind of work might provide to institutions and people across all 50 states in the years to come. But if that Smithsonian unit is approved, it's going to need money and support and good ideas from people like us. So these are 5 elements of what I've called here today a 2026 project with this 250th anniversary in mind. I've tried here to emphasize the importance of a principled and energetic Latino public humanities agenda for the coming decade. And I would hope that this contributes in some ways to conversations about building a greater sense of civic empowerment and belonging for Latinos in Texas as elsewhere, as Cecilia outlined in her discussion today. Perhaps the most important principle at all for me in this public humanities work is that we should be insisting in the 2020s on more and not less. We need more resources, we need more voices to be heard in the public sphere, we need more perspectives, more representation, more acknowledgement of contradiction. We need more tough conversations. We are many, somos muchos, and as Latinos committed to history and to cultural expression, to this work in the public humanities, we should be thinking in terms of mass. Thank you.
Absolutely, we should be thinking about mass. That was wonderful. What a great agenda. I have a few questions from the audience, and I think we're going to start with Cecilia and Michelle. This is a question about the election. So the question is, I know the media has discussed the need to look at differences among diverse Latinx voting groups like Mexican Americans, Salvadoreños, Cubans, etc. And there was a recent New York Times article on Latino men and Trump's appeal. I'm wondering if panelists could comment on how race and class might figure into differences in voting behavior among Latinx voting or non-voting groups.
I'll start by saying I want a T-shirt that says "Mas." Actually, it's a beautiful way to capture what all of us here on the panel are up to in our respective work and what we should keep thinking. I love it. Yeah, there's a lot of diversity. You know, the typical narrative out there is that Latino voters are diverse because they're from different countries and they have different histories. And that's absolutely true. But what we found and were honestly kind of astonished by was the diversity of views just among working class Mexican Americans, for instance, or Mexican Americans in Texas overall. And so, you know, the outcome in the Rio Grande Valley this year was maybe sort of on average 60-40 Biden-Trump among Latinos there. And it was people within the same families that were voting, some siblings and for one candidate and some for another. And the media narratives, you know, the way we think in political science about voters is purely along these demographic categories. And are you rural or urban? Are you, you know, second generation, or are you immigrant? You know, we found immigrants that were voting for Trump, right? Children of immigrants voting for Trump. And so I just think like I hate that my answer as an anthropologist is always that everything is more complex and more complex, right? It's basically the answer to everything. But as far as like the appeal on gender terms, I mean, there is a gender gap overall in the polls in terms of Latinos who vote for Trump and who don't. There's a gender gap also among Blacks and whites. Is it bigger? It's in some polls, it's a little bigger among Latinos and Blacks, and others it's about the same. But what I heard a lot on the ground in the Valley, for instance, was people, including women who were big supporters of Donald Trump, who talk about it in terms of like strength and that they want a leader who is a kind of A-type, you know, that sort of takes control. And even women were speaking in this language. And so I don't want to narrow, there is a gender gap, we need to acknowledge it, but I also want to make that a little more complex than Latinos just like macho men. And actually, I think something that's a little misleading about the narrative is it's more of a culture of American masculinity when you do see that, because you see it more among second, third generation Mexican Americans. I think if it was a Latino, if it came from Latino machismo, which does exist, I'm not denying it doesn't, denying that it exists, but you would see that more among immigrants and children of immigrants. And in terms of class, like I think another interesting thing about some of these newer Trump supporters is that they are working class. And so there's a kind of populism and nationalism that we need to think about and understand better in those communities, because it's not simply white nationalism. Like people on the border is a very real thing and they're reacting to it in different ways. Some people being very assertive of border security and then others being very sympathetic to immigrant realities. But we did also see a relationship between income and voting propensity. And our study was not quantitative, but when we ran the numbers of 100 people we spoke with, there was a perfect relationship between income level and how likely you are to vote. You know, especially in the non-voters and the most regular voters. They were extreme opposites in terms of the makeup. And yeah, I think that answers the question to the degree that I can answer it.
Okay. I don't know if you wanted to add anything, Michelle.
Yeah, I do. I mean, just that I think, you know, on the one hand, I really appreciate the conversation that we're having about Latino voters at the end of this election. And on the other hand, it is a bit frustrating because, you know, I mean, again, you know, we commissioned this study 2 years ago because we know in our own work that this is a phenomenon, right? So, and, you know, overwhelmingly what we know is that it is about creating a relationship. And, you know, that might sound difficult, but if you just think about how much time and money, and we're talking hundreds of millions of dollars and probably billions over, you know, election cycles, go into trying to have a relationship with quote unquote swing white voters, right? Like how much there's an entire industry set up around that, and yet you don't see results. And so you're trying to form a relationship with those voters. Like, how about you try to form a relationship with people who would be with you if you had a relationship, right? Like there's a, and I think, you know, somebody asked a question earlier about did Dems not, were they not visible in the Rio Grande Valley? You know, one other thing that I just find it important to mention about RGV is that, you know, one, we're talking a lot about the voting for Trump. Also, this is a part of the state that very much loved Bernie Sanders. And, you know, we're talking about the same families, right? I'm not suggesting the same people voted for Bernie Sanders in the primary and then switched to Trump, but they're the same families. It's the same community, as Cecilia was referencing earlier. And two, the Libre Initiative, which is a Koch brother funded organization, you can Google them, has been pouring in millions of dollars into forming relationships with Latinos, and in particular in the Valley, for probably 15 years. And so some of these shifts are, you know, one, I'm not sure that they're shifts, right? Like Governor Abbott also enjoys close to 40% of support among Latino voters, Rick Perry before him, George W. before him, right? So if we are rooted in the data, Latinos are complicated and have been complicated forever, right? So I'm really happy we're talking about it now. And also, you know, it's going to take real work. And again, it isn't like, I think one thing I always end up saying every time we do this presentation is that, you know, our government, elected officials, politicians, they invest in relationships with voters every single day. They just don't do it with Latinos, not in the way that they should.
Thank you. I'm just one more question I want to make sure we don't miss before we run out of our hour. This is a question about the future of the Smithsonian Latino Museum. So this will be for Dr. Pitti. And I also want to just mention that yesterday you had an op-ed in the Los Angeles Times about the Latino Institute or the Latino Museum. Do you think that you know, eventually this is going to happen? What do you think?
Yes, I do think eventually it's going to happen. I think folks who are interested in seeing it happen should certainly call their congressional reps in both the House and the Senate to make the push. I think there's a reasonable chance it's going to happen this week, but it's certainly not a sure thing. Can I just say, I think one of the things that connects some of what I said to some of what Cecilia and Michelle has said is the importance of narratives. I think that, you know, Cecilia used this word a number of times. You know, in my mind, this strikes at the heart of why the public humanities are so important. Because when we do public humanities work, we establish narratives to help people position themselves in history, to position themselves next to one another and understand, you know, their shared stories, their potential alliances with one another. It allows them to imagine new futures that they might not otherwise have imagined, and to think about alliances and demands that they might have taken for granted as being off the table. So, you know, I think that the public humanities can do many things, but as I listen to the great comments by Cecilia and Michelle, one of the things I want to underscore is that narratives in some ways is the work of public humanities, and it does get back to helping rethink politics and make political progress in ways I think we all agree are so important.
Yes, yes, that's wonderful. Okay, we are at the end of our hour, so that was perfect timing. I want to thank our panelists today. What a fantastic conversation. You can follow all of these fine people on Twitter, and please, you know, keep engaged with these topics, and we here at MACRI will certainly try to help keep you engaged on these topics and continue these conversations and continue our work on increasing narratives, expanding narratives, and breaking down barriers to public history. I want to wish everybody a happy and very safe holiday season. We want to see you back in 2021, so please do take precautions, keep yourself and your community safe. Thank you.